Our next speaker is the head of climate services at the UK Met Office. You've seen him several times already today, so he's a familiar face, and he's put a lot of work into planning this conference. I think we can get started and have people come in. So Chris Hewitt will give a talk on the UK perspective on climate services. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. Is my talk... Thank you. Is everybody in, Simon? Are there still people outside? I'll start fairly slowly then, okay. So, perhaps while people are coming in, a brief bio of myself. So I joined the Met Office, went into the Hadley Centre and did climate change research for about 10 years. So my background is in climate change research. And then I moved into managing a large European project on climate change, climate impacts, and starting to look at how we serve society with the climate information. So it was a climate service in some ways, that project. And then I moved into the business side of the Met Office, so then providing climate, or weather and climate information to industry. And I was there for about 2 years, and that was very, very interesting to engage more with the users, the decision makers. And so after that, for about the last 2 years now, I've been involved in the climate service part of the Met Office. So it's been very useful, and there's several other people, I imagine, perhaps lots of people in the room have had a similar path, being involved in the climate research itself, generating the information, being involved in helping generate knowledge, and then working with the users in a more service-orientated approach. So I'm going to give some perspectives on, so these will be largely my perspectives, the Met Office's perspectives in the UK. Why have a climate service at all? What is a climate service? That's come up a few times over the last 24 hours. What's actually happening in the UK as an example of activities in this area, and then I'll give some specific climate services. We'll see how we're doing on time and how far we get through this. And I've realised I feel sorry for the speakers now. It's quite difficult standing here and reading the slides at an angle. So why have a climate service? What are the drivers? And this is very much from a UK and a Met Office perspective. And so these drivers may be common in other countries and they may be completely different. But from our perspective, so we're supporting decision making in terms of adaptation decisions, building resilience within the UK, mitigation options. So mitigation came up this morning. So we're very much involved in dealing with the mitigation issue. And this has been reflected in our customers' requirements, so within the UK government, that's our biggest customer, but also from our industry customers, the general public, our international engagements, what we're seeing from the Global Framework for Climate Services. UK SIP I'll come back to later, that's the UK Climate Impact Programme, so that's been very much linking up with the users, and so feedback we've had from the UK SIP process. The demand for consultancy work, so providing value-added information and bespoke services for customers. So all of this we're seeing from our large range of customers. There's a strong drive here for having climate service to support decision-making. Over the last few years, we've seen an increased focus on the nearer-term timescales. This came up yesterday. Traditionally, climate science was focusing on end of the century, partly because this was a signal-to-noise issue. So as we went out towards the end of the century, we could see the signal clearer from the noise of climate variability. But we're now seeing much more interest on these nearer timescales from seasons out to years ahead. And on these timescales, the information needs to be routinely updated. So some people may interpret this as having operational information. Much more focus on regional and local scales. So again, climate science was largely dealing with the big picture, the global, perhaps global average temperature changes. And as the science has improved and as we're seeing more demand, there's much more information needed on regional and local scales. I think it was Simon yesterday brought this up, so we're exposed to weather really, not so much climate, and so often, or nearly always, the user interest is largely around the characteristics of particularly hazardous weather. Not always hazardous weather, but that's often the impacts they're worried about. And this has come up again, it's not just about weather and climate, it's what is the impact of weather and climate effect on society or industry or whatever it is in particular. And there's a rapidly growing demand for this information, climate data and climate advice in the UK, and as we heard from the breakout groups, it's clearly evident around the world. So the CBI in the UK, Confederation of British Industries, produced a report just over a year ago. The impact of climate change needs to be made part of an ongoing risk management. It's not just, here's the answer, go away and you don't have to worry about it again. It's an ongoing risk management process. And they felt quite strongly that the government, so this is the UK government, must help ensure that businesses have the information needed to take action. Most of this data is already in the public domain, but needs to be made available in an easy-to-use format. So it's pleasing to hear this was something that came out of one of the breakout groups from yesterday. I can't remember who produced this diagram. Might have been someone in America, but I quite like this diagram for what is a climate service. So this, admittedly, this is very much my opinion. Other people have different opinions. But in terms of a climate service, which it might sound pedantic, but I think this is different to the climate service is, the overall climate service I see as an end-to-end program where you include observations and models, products and services, and this was highlighted yesterday by the WMO in the global framework. They also look at all of these different components to talk about a climate service. And so we have the stakeholders and customers at the top who have various needs, and so we develop basic research and development for the underpinning science, model development, observational studies. We need the infrastructure in place, the IT, the supercomputing, data and data informatics, so information about the data and how to deal with the data, web-based tools, visualization tools, and an increasing focus now on using this basic R&D to have applied research and development, so using the prediction systems, evaluating the forecasts, and having customer-driven products. And so the way this all links together, perhaps in the past it's been very much bottom-up, so the observations and the data analyses have been used to produce predictions, attributions and hindcasts, which then produce the products and services, and that's what the stakeholders and customers would get. It was largely driven science up as to what they would get, but there's been much more focus now, which I think is really around the ethos of the whole climate service idea, is the stakeholders and customers have an important role here, so it's the arrows coming down here. So they inform the products and services that we should be developing. That informs the predictions, attributions and hindcasts that are needed for those products and services. That helps us identify the observations and the data analyses that we need. So in terms of the Met Office, the climate service from our perspective is the end-to-end program, as I said. These monthly, seasonal, decadal timescales are becoming increasingly important now, so we have a large focus on the research side, developing capability on this timescale. It's a large international focus as well now through IPCC, and next week at the WCRP Open Science Conference. Developing high-resolution Earth system models, so high resolution won't necessarily get you a better, more useful information system, but you hope you will start to capture the processes better, important features like land-sea contrasts, topography. So moving towards higher resolution and Earth system models, not just about, somebody showed the diagram yesterday, how it had evolved through IPCC from the first assessment report. We're including more and more components of the Earth system. Very much looking at information and advice on climate extremes and hazardous weather. And this is something that's very much coming out of this conference. No one organisation can do all of this. It's very much built around collaboration and forming partnerships. So the UK Met Office is the National Weather Service, and this is an expansion, a natural expansion of that, so moving into being a national climate service. And we have, well, we already are doing this and would like to do more of this, working with other countries to help them provide their climate services. So this came up yesterday, I think it was Bruce, talking about developing services for Africa, in Africa, for example. So it's not about a national Met Service like the UK Met Office doing this for a country, it's doing it with a country if they want to work in that partnership. And just some notes, so there are already lots of climate-related services in the Met Office and other organisations. This is very much building on those existing services. It's not just ripping it all up and starting all over again. It's building on what we've already learnt. The underpinning science is at the core of this, and that's one of the breakout groups later this morning. So science is very much at the centre of our approach. And while this might sound like it's all about adaptation, it's not. We also provide advice to inform mitigation policies, but the newer parts are more about the adaptation, as Guy highlighted earlier. So the Met Office Hadley Centre, where I work, just a quick overview. It's established just over 20 years ago now. It's currently about 160 staff, mostly climate scientists. It undertakes climate research, both for the UK but also involved in international activities, and that research includes observations, monitoring, attribution, modelling, prediction, etc. So in the UK, we have very strong interactions within the UK with the research councils, the universities. We have a joint weather and climate research programme in the UK. It's taken many, many years to get going, but it's now very successful. So it brings together the research councils, the universities and the Met Office to develop science. I mean, there'll be particular projects underway under that, but it's very much to bring the whole UK community together. We have strong interactions with the UK government. Government, as I said, are our biggest funders for this, and we have been developing more and more interactions with industry within the UK. And as I said, we're developing a national climate service within the UK. So it's not just the Met Office, this national climate service, it's involving the other climate relevant institutions in the UK. So how do we engage? So at the global level, through the WMO, we're one of the global producing centres for long-range forecasts, very much engaged in the global framework for climate services, engaged at this conference here. You're probably getting fed up seeing my face, and this will be the last time I'll be standing up here at this meeting, I think. So bear with me for another 15 or so minutes. We're involved in various international projects. I'll show some examples shortly. Involved strongly in the IPCC process. So regionally, we also operate strongly within Europe. So we have lots of collaborations within Europe with other national Met services. There are formal collaborations between all the Met services in Europe. Collaborate with universities across Europe and also with industry. The European Union, European Commission, they fund lots of research activities interested in climate services. And then the European Network for Earth System Modelling, we're involved in that as well. So Sylvie Jassomme and Guy Brasseur are very much leading on that. And then nationally, so I mentioned we have these strong UK collaborations. I'll talk more about these two next points here. We have national projections for the UK Climate Projections 2009, the UK Climate Impacts Programme, and a national climate change risk assessment. And then we also operate on the local scale within the country. So, for example, I'll show an example of the Thames Barrier, it's a flood defence system for the City of London. So now the UK activities, these national climate projections, the UK Climate Impacts Programme and the Climate Change Risk Assessment. Bear with me, Simon. This could be controversial. So back in 2002, the UK Climate Impacts Programme 2002 produced information for the UK, and the projections were basically a single projection. So taking the global models, downscaling to, I think this was a 50-kilometre resolution for the UK, and then providing this information as a set of sort of authoritative national projections for the UK for decision makers to then use this information to inform their decisions. And this was just a single projection. No indication of uncertainties, and so lots of criticism after this was released. You know, there's lots of uncertainties in your climate models and the emission scenarios, etc. Although this did use 3 different emission scenarios. And so then, for 7 years later, we then produced the 2009 update of this, which then used a large ensemble to start to try and take account and be a bit more honest and open about the uncertainties. So as it says here, moving from uncertainty to probabilities and likelihoods. I like the idea of a range of probabilities, actually. I'll have to think a bit more about that. But this was now starting to give an indication to the users and the decision makers to help them understand in a more probabilistic framework that the information we provide isn't just a single projection as it was over here, which admittedly this was probably the state of the art, this approach back in those days in terms of IPCC. But now the international community is moving much more towards giving information to help people understand there's a range of outcomes here. So the UK CP09 is a set of projections which is used to provide information that's consistent information for national climate change impact studies. This is just in the UK, based on a large ensemble of climate simulations from HADCM3 climate model. This was combined with the results from other climate models, so using models from the IPCC data archive, constrained all of this by observations, and then expressed in probabilistic form. And these were expressed as 30-year mean periods throughout the 21st century, so this wasn't giving detailed information in terms of annual figures, this was 30-year mean periods. This was used for the UK Climate Impacts Programme, and the UK Climate Impacts Programme made the climate model information available, so the discussion we had earlier about data and access, the model results for the UK were made available to the community through an organisation, BADC. And then people then use this for their own applications, so flood management, agriculture, construction, energy, health. So these applications using the same climate model information to inform their decision-making process. And then these results have now been used extensively in the first national climate change risk assessment that we have in the UK, which is to be published in a few months' time. So this was launched about a year ago. And there was a big meeting in London and a report was released. So the Secretary of State for Environment at the time made this quote here: "Today's report provides a wake-up call. It recognises there is no part of our society which is immune from the effects of climate change. So every part of our society must think about its resilience to climate change. And all of us should take steps now to recognise the problem." Maybe not all of us, but most of us should take steps now to recognise the problem, analyse the risk and plan ahead. Good comment there. Much more needed to be done, so it's not pretending this is the final answer. The science will evolve, the applications will evolve, the understanding. But a call here for everybody to get involved, businesses, citizens and consumers. So a very strong message from the UK government to UK society. So the Climate Change Risk Assessment, we had the Climate Change Act was decreed in 2008, so this is effectively law in the UK to deal with mitigation and adaptation. Climate projections then came out a year later to then form the basis for this national climate change risk assessment, which has been going for about 3 years. And so there is a subcommittee of experts who are part of this process. So they have looked at the methods that have been used for this climate change risk assessment, and then they will be, I guess now, they're looking at the findings. I haven't actually seen the findings, so I'm afraid I won't be able to answer questions on the actual climate change risk assessment, but it will be released and publicly available beginning of next year. How long have I got left, Kathy? I'm not quite sure how many of these I'm going to get through. I'm not going to get through all of these. So some examples of climate services. So far I've been talking about the whole framework, a whole climate service framework, which is the end-to-end activity. And this conference here, I think we're probably focusing more on the climate services. I might be wrong, but that's perhaps the discussions I've heard so far have done that. So UK CP09, that was a climate service for the UK, provided climate scenarios which were then used for the UK Climate Impacts Programme. So that was a specific service. So then I've got some other ones here, and let's just see how far we get. So the first one is a core climate service. Now, some people think this isn't really a climate service. However, our government customers, this is where most of our funding comes from, they see this as a service. They pay for the core underpinning science. They have specific needs from this. So the Department of Energy and Climate Change, DEC, and DEFRA, Department of Environment, they fund this programme. They're very clear on this, that collaboration is key to this. They want us to collaborate nationally and internationally on the science, the models and the predictions. And what they get is policy-focused advice and evidence base for mitigation and adaptation. We don't make the policy. We provide information that helps inform their policy decisions. So that's quite a clear distinction, which sometimes gets confused perhaps in the UK press. But we help them make their decisions. And then they also are generating underpinning capability for the UK and also through collaboration internationally as well. So that's very much our core climate service, strange as it seems. There's a focus on knowledge integration here, so the knowledge needs to be made policy relevant. We provide expert advice, and it's all built on a strong publication record. They're very keen for peer review, for independent opinions on this. So perhaps what we might consider as more traditional climate services. So Thames Estuary 2100 project, this was done a year or two ago now. This was based on the same information, the UK CP09 projections that I mentioned. And the Environment Agency in the UK were the customer for this, and they wanted to have advice for the development of a tidal flood risk management plan for the River Thames in London. So there's a picture here of a large tidal flood barrier, so these defences can be raised when there's a risk of high water levels for the City of London, so storm surges down the North Sea and waves associated with that. So we worked with the Proudman Oceanographic Laboratory in the UK, who have expertise on wave modelling, and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, who have expertise on river flows. So it's very much a partnership. So an example of this wasn't something that the Met Office could do on its own, involving the relevant organisations, and then give information to the customer here about adaptation, essentially. So what they wanted to know is this barrier fit for purpose throughout the 21st century to protect the City of London under gradual rising sea levels, storm surges. An interesting conclusion from this was they went for, as I understand it, a staged adaptation approach. So this isn't a decision they have to necessarily make today, and the conclusion was that under some extreme scenarios, the barrier will protect London for the foreseeable future, but there's lots of uncertainty around sea level rise, the modelling, etc. And so the decision was, as we do more research and understanding about these uncertainties, to review the decision. So in a few years' time, I don't know how many years, but in the future, review this decision and see if the barrier needs to be either rebuilt or relocated. But at the moment, they're happy that the barrier is fit for purpose at the moment. We work with the energy companies across the UK to look at the resilience of their electricity network as a climate change risk assessment. And so their infrastructure is vulnerable to various weather-related events, lightning, snow, sleet and blizzard, wind and gale, etc. Perhaps the interesting thing about this was working with the energy sector. They're very, very meteorologically literate. In some ways, they're a dream customer. They understand meteorology. They have meteorologists working in their organisations. And so you can have relatively easy conversations with them, and it's actually a very good industry to work with, a very good sector to work with. Hazel Thornton, who is sitting near the back, was involved in this project, so if you're interested in that, please grab her at coffee breaks or lunch breaks. Study for the River Nile. So this one, the customer was the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation in Egypt, but they didn't fund this, so the funder was a third party, the United Nations Environment Programme. And looking at river flow, in particular the river flow into the High Aswan Dam, and going into the future looking at it under climate change. So again, this wasn't something we could do on our own, so we partnered with the Danish Hydrological Institute, and very successful project which has now led to more interest from, I guess it's from UNEP again, but certainly from the Egyptians. Another sector that was mentioned yesterday is the insurance and reinsurance sector. So we've been working for a few years now on developing a climate service for that sector in terms of global risks for them. So we have climate science that's relevant to their operational risk pricing decisions. So we developed a set of proposals, very much developed it with them, not this is our proposal, this is what you're going to want. It was working with the users and the decision makers to understand what their needs were. So develop these proposals to address their core needs, which turned out to be, in brief here, forecasting needs on weeks to 5-year timescales. Again, this came up yesterday, so bridging these different timescales. Doing targeted research for this sector, so we can extend our forecasts of various events. We can understand teleconnections, joint perils. So, for example, when a big storm goes through, you often get a lot of wind and a lot of rain, so you can get perils from both the wind and the rainfall. And then we have an operational, well, we maximise the use of our joint operational weather and climate science interaction. So we have teams in the Met Office who are involved in operational weather forecasting and teams who are involved on the seasonal timescales and operational seasonal forecasting. So back in 2010, a core group of clients joined this project for a 6-month first phase. And while there was lots of iterations and discussions, again, this is another group of people who are relatively easy to work with. They have meteorologists in their organisations as well. They're very much used to dealing with probabilities and risks, as were the energy companies. So a fairly good sector to work with. So what they receive reports from us, they receive regular forecasts, podcasts, so starting to move a bit more into modern technology. I don't know if, actually, yeah, there are Twitter feeds. They get teleconferences, and their key interests, tropical storms, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, interested in information on tropical storms in the coming season to years, up to a decade. Seamless global hazard forecasts, so these hazards forecast over timescales from weeks out to years. They very much like to hear about the science. They like hearing from expert scientists through these podcasts and teleconferences. I guess they feel they're getting confidence about the information they're receiving. And as I said, they fund research. How long have I got left? A couple of minutes. So our Department for International Development, we have a 3-year program with them, Climate Science Research Partnership, looking at African climate and its drivers. So this started back in January of 2010. And the aim is here to improve the understanding and modelling of African climates, again on these timescales, monthly to seasonal to decadal timescales, not so much the longer climate change timescales. It's very much driven by the users, so the users have been involved in this throughout. Right at the beginning of the project, time was spent going around Africa talking to various users and decision makers to find out what it is that they're interested in, so what predictions we can usefully provide, what we need to improve, what products they would be interested in, and what advice they need so they can adapt to climate and climate variability. And this is very much about building capacity in Africa. It's not a 3-year project, there you go, there's the results. It's about building the capability and capacity of scientists within Africa so there will be improved climate services within the country. So in terms of a vision on the science side, we're very much moving towards developing, as I said at the beginning, it is more around higher resolution. That's one of the key focuses. So global climate models typically have a resolution of 100, 200 kilometres, which probably isn't good enough for a lot of impacts models and a lot of decision-making purposes. So the global community, which I think will probably be discussed in the breakout group shortly, moving towards increasing the resolution to capture processes better and start to be able to provide information on spatial scales that the users are interested in. But even then, there's a need to do downscaling, as came up earlier. So to try and produce, the aim here is regional predictions. So this would be, for example, for the UK, at maybe 1 kilometre scale, so we can start to talk about the local meteorology. And then turning all of this into information and probability or range of probabilities about the hazard, so that the decision makers can then combine that with information about the vulnerability, so they can assess their risk and the impacts on them. So some concluding thoughts. There are many climate service initiatives underway already, and we must build upon what is already happening rather than just ignore it, learn lessons from what's happening, exploit the best things that are happening out there, which is what we're doing at this conference, learning, and deliver added value. The Global Framework for Climate Services, the primary objective, provides services to those communities that are most vulnerable to climate variability and climate change, and I fully support that. That's a fantastic, achievable aim. So that's something fairly clear the WMO are aiming for, and I think we can also consider that in our discussions. The Global Framework is thinking about creating national frameworks. So the example I gave for the UK is very much around creating a national UK framework for this, a national climate service. So within the nation, you understand where it is that you can go for information, you have consistent information provided to you. So the Global Framework isn't just thinking about global framework for climate service, it's thinking about national frameworks as well. And in the UK, personally, I think that's been very successful, and I strongly support that. And the last point there on the GFCS needs to be supported by a properly focused research programme. So again, at Met Office, we think research is very much at the core of this. And that's something that we personally think is very important as well. And final point, closer interaction between users and climate service developers. So our experience with the insurance sector and the energy sector has been very valuable. We've had very close interaction with those sectors and with the UK government, and that's been very, very fruitful. Personally, I think that's something we need to do more of. We need to have much closer interaction, and that's pretty much consistent with the discussions we've had here. So I will finish there. Thank you. Guy's going to chair. I'm not going to chair myself. Good.
Okay, and any questions, please?
How do you outline all the users as being very high level policy areas? How do you work with your, for me, it's used to be your farmers. Do you have an avenue to work with that group? Your farmers, your local community?
So this came up in our breakout group yesterday with the Ethiopian example. So that's a massive challenge. So there are, I don't know how many farmers in the UK, but there are a lot of farmers. So when you get down to that very individual level, it's very difficult. So we are just undertaking a project working with various sectors in the southwest of England. So that is a very local region. And we're going to see how successful that is to try and engage at these, which is now becoming very resource intensive to actually have the people available to engage at such a local level. So the approach that we adopt, and most people adopt, I suspect, is to try and automate a lot of this information. So with the UK SIP approach, the UK Climate Impacts Programme, the information was made available through a central system, a central organisation, who then have a chance to engage with those individuals, or, perhaps slightly more worrying, individuals can just take the information and perhaps misuse it, which I think is something, I think it was Simon, or was it Bruce? Bruce talked about yesterday, about the danger of putting information out there and making it freely available. There is a chance it could be misused. So that is a real challenge for how you will engage with the millions or potentially billions of individual users, and certainly millions of companies around the world and organisations.
So you don't actually have some kind of extension?
So we have a team of people. So Hazel is in this team. We've been growing a team fairly steadily over the last few years of people who fit this role between the climate scientists in the Met Office and the users. And this team then interact with both groups of people. They act as a translator role between these two groups. But even with this team, I don't know how many is in it now, 20 or 30 people. Even then, you can't reach out to the 60 million people in the UK and the however many thousand farmers there are. That is a real challenge.
1, 2, then. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Jean Christophe. I work for the Specialist Climate Change Adaptation Consultancy at Habitats, based in the UK and Canada.
Can you take the microphone?
Oh, thank you. So I work for the Specialist Climate Change Adaptation Consultancy, Acclimatize, in the UK and Canada. And I'm curious to know how your work with the private sector has come along. Have they come to the UK Met Office with a very detailed scope of work, or have they knocked on the government's door, on UK SIP's door, asking them who could we speak to get those climate services? In our experience, because we've also been involved with the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, with private companies in the UK like E.ON or British Gas, working with them on improving the climate risk management services takes a long journey of explaining to them the industry drivers for improving the climate risk management and understanding the specific drivers, the drivers specific to their own business. And so do you think that there's lessons in the UK that could be applicable to the Climate Services Partnership, or do you think that the success in climate services in the UK is partly due to the fact that there's the UK Climate Change Act, that the government is fairly proactive in this field, and that there's a good public awareness on the need to adapt to climate change?
Okay, that's a great question. In some ways it's related to the previous one as well. So to start at the beginning of where you were asking, so we do get approached directly by various organisations, industry, government departments. So there is that direct where we are then very reactive, I suppose. So in some ways we get flooded with those requests, as I'm sure other climate service centres in the room are probably able to sort of understand that. So we get flooded with those requests, and that is a challenge for how you deal with all of the requests. So the example of the farmers earlier. So that is one area where we do get work. A lot of work and interest comes in through that. Some of the activities, I guess we try and determine which organisations and sectors and government departments we'd like to work with. So I sort of called it strategic partnerships on one of the earlier slides. So try and identify what it is we think will be very useful to the Met Office, to the UK, to the international community, and then try and work with those sectors so we can then develop science. So for example, the insurance sector is one of those interesting, and reinsurance, one of those interesting sectors where they are interested in developing the climate capability, the climate science and the climate knowledge. So that's quite an attractive area to work with. So while we react to those requests, we do also proactively look at some of those areas as well. So seeing how we want to develop our capability and where it is we might be able to do that. Well, you asked so many questions, I can't remember what the other ones were, but there's a mixed bag on how it works in the UK. So in terms of lessons learned, it is very, very time consuming though. It involves individuals, and they need to be the right individuals who can talk about the climate science, so they understand the science. In some ways, you might think a climate expert would be the ideal person, but then if we have our climate experts going around talking to end users, they're not going to have time to do the science and develop it further. So there is a real balance between trying to have a perfect group of people who I've called translators, and in developing this conference we thought of this group of translators as well. So this group of people are able to understand the science sufficiently, able to interact sufficiently with the users and the decision makers. That's not a very large group of people around the world as far as I'm aware. So it's taken us several years and quite a decision by the Met Office to invest in this, and we're seeing it to be very useful. So personally, I would suggest that, but it's up to each organisation, I suppose, to depend how they want to do it. But for us, that's been very successful. And the whole UK Climate Impacts Programme approach, so the UK government has been very supportive of this, and that has helped.
Okay, we'll try to get a few more questions, but they should be short.
I'll answer shorter, yeah. Give me a yes or no.
What about you?
Thanks very much, Chris. That was an excellent presentation. I'm Wayne Higgins, the director of the Climate Prediction Center here in the Weather Service in the States. It's striking to me how many challenges we have in common on the science side. I actually would comment a bit further on the national framework for climate service, and in particular, you know, we're struggling with climate service in NOAA, and we're trying to draw a distinction between the NOAA climate service and the national climate service as well. And so there's been lots of discussion about national climate service partnerships versus, you know, a lead agency, you know, playing a strong role. How in the UK are you approaching the issue of the national climate service, and what role do the core services play in that?
This isn't going to be a short answer, so I'll have to think of a short answer. There really isn't a short answer to this one. It's taken, so I talked about, for example, this joint climate and weather research programme. So it's taken several years to bring the UK organisations together, so the universities, the research councils, the Met Office. It's something that's been evolving for the last 10 or 20 years, but we've now got to a stage where we're working very closely together. So the research councils, universities and the Met Office coming together has probably, I'm guessing, I mean, I might not, what I'm about to say might not be a perfect answer, but in terms of time, that's been a very strong driver for producing a national climate service. The government, with its approach to this UK Climate Impacts Programme and the UK Climate Projections, has also been another strong driver for this. So the Climate Change Act, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, all of these things in place have come together to make it an obvious way forward, and I guess relatively painless way forward in the UK. I don't know about other countries, but that's our experience. So I don't know if we've had it good. It's been a lot of hard work, but it's certainly all coming together nicely.
So patience and perseverance.
And support.
And support. Your turn. And I will take one more, and then it's yours. One.
Chris, my name is Mohamed Boulaya, advisor within the ClimDev Africa program. So many questions, but I will limit to one, as said, just the governance of the National Climate Services. Is it a contract between the UK Met Office and any big user, governmental or other, or is it a board of the different institutions running the whole process? And with one or the other answer, we might have quite an answer to the other question raised by the other. So is it National Climate Services Board, made by everyone, or just a contract between whatever the form of the contract? Okay, thank you.
So it's not a contract, and that would be quite a, I guess, a powerful way forward if other countries were going to try and do this. If there was a contract, I can see how the resources would then be made available. It's not a contract, no, it's much more informal than that. So it's I guess what you were saying about a board. So there are high-level people from the relevant organisations get together and agree this is a sensible way forward, but it's not a specific contract with the UK government or anybody.
Last question.
Hi, Chris. Sorry. I was surprised that you didn't mention something that's come up in all the out of all the breakout sessions from yesterday, which was this idea of chains of information and how you serve users at different scales or different levels of granularity by working with chains that are sort of pre-existing, working within systems that already exist within communities of users. In your answer to Fiona's question, you were talking about the difficulty of building sort of an army of climate advisors rather than introducing some of these ideas. I was just wondering if those aren't seen as viable, connecting to these chains or working through other communities of expertise, or if that's just not been given much thought, you know, just
no,
where
it
you...
has, so yeah, we do work with lots of different communities. Now, the example I gave, I think, was just an example about Southwest England, where we're trying to engage very much at a local level, but that's not the only way that we engage. So lots of it is done through, well, the UK CIP approach, the UK Climate Impacts Programme, so engaging with that approach. So there's another organisation who's then available to interact closer with users and decision makers. There's a whole range of approaches. I'm not sure there's necessarily one approach that's the killer approach. And again, it'll be different in different countries, I suspect. But no, it's not just one approach. Sorry if I gave that impression.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I think the UK has set a really great example of how a climate service at the national level could be run. I think it would be also interesting to have perhaps as an outcome of this conference, a bit of a survey of what happens in different countries of the world, because the UK example is probably the most advanced, but there are other now meteorological services in particular who are kind of following that example, and having an inventory of what's happening would be something that maybe we could produce.